Why are we still here? Just to suffer. Every night, I can feel my leg and my arm, even my fingers. The body I've lost, the comrades I've lost, won't stop hurting. It's like they're all still there. You feel it too, don't you? And I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules.
Up yours, woke moralist! We'll see who cancels!
I'm sure a lot of you saw Jordan Peterson, like, utterly embarrassing himself on the Jubilee YouTube channel, debating teenagers and students about religion.
Why is that relevant?
Because you go to a Catholic church, don't you? Or you've attended recently. You're interested in Catholicism, aren't you?
Sure.
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrines?
Somewhat.
Okay, you're
Their
familiar.
doctrines are very
how do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a
'cause I
Christian
won't
or you're
talk
not.
to you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression
private.
I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
Seeing, like, another round of roasting of Jordan Peterson was funny, and seeing all this made me reflect on his trajectory since I've been covering him. Now, I believe I made my first video on him in either 2017 or 2018, and he used to have a lot of respect. And some of you probably don't remember this. There was a time in the liberal media bubble that new people would come along, and the way they'd get covered in the mainstream media would make you feel like, well, I have to take this person seriously because everyone seems to, like, take them very seriously, right? And previously, obviously, this happened with someone like Ben Shapiro. It happened with loads of conservatives, that you'd get a conservative saying something very inflammatory, and then the whole liberal media would fall over themselves to prop them up. Now, Jordan Peterson is probably the best example of this, and it basically gave him a whole career. Now, of course, he is famous for writing this self-help book, which some people have said has helped them. I was actually going to review the book once before realizing it's like 400 pages. I just didn't want to do that to myself, but I believe there are other left-wing YouTubers who have reviewed his books. But I wanted to mainly focus on him as, like, a more political figure today and just go through his controversies, his evolution, I guess. And I just have, like, a timeline in front of me that I want to go through in how he became what he became and how he went from, like, a sort of respected figure because of what I said before into something that is just, like, a complete joke. And even old Jordan Peterson has tweeted at me for various reasons. And I almost forgot this. Part of, like, the core of Jordan Peterson's worldview is he's a hysterical anti-communist. And I just kind of forgot that because obviously right now he's such a hardcore Christian conservative. That's kind of like part and parcel of being one of these people, right? Before, when he was trying to portray himself as a more, like, centrist person, the anti-communism was, like, absolutely insane, and he would talk about it non-stop. So I just thought it'd be fun to go through all of this today, play some clips of some older videos of me covering him, and just talk about how he's managed to basically alienate so many people who actually used to like him, either for his political views or his self-help books as well. So before we get into the video, if you like my videos and you want to see more, maybe subscribe, maybe like the video if you like it when you finished it, and consider supporting me on Patreon or on YouTube memberships, and consider following me on social media at the Kavernacle on Blue Sky and on my various Instagram pages. So let's get into the timeline. So I initially became aware of Jordan Peterson, I think it was in 2017. There is a record of him being on Canadian TV. He was a pretty well-regarded university professor and had taught at, like, very respectable universities. But when we're talking about his, like, mainstream relevance in terms of politics, we have to talk about his anti-communism mixed in with his anti-trans bigotry. So just an article going all the way back to November 2016 Toronto professor Jordan Peterson takes on gender-neutral pronouns. And again, this is from the BBC, so it's trying to be neutral. A Canadian university professor ignited controversy by refusing to use gender-neutral pronouns. Is he a villain or a victim? University of Toronto psychology professor Jordan Peterson had enough of what he saw as a campus culture where social justice warrior left-wing radical political activists ran rampant. In September, he released a video lecture series taking aim at political correctness. He zeroed in on Canadian human rights legislation that prohibits discrimination based on gender identity or expression. Dr. Peterson was especially frustrated being asked to use alternative pronouns as requested by transgender students or staff. In his opposition, he set off a political and cultural firestorm that shows no signs of abating. At a free speech rally in mid-October, he was drowned out by a white noise machine. He says the lock on his door was glued shut. At the same time, the University of Toronto said it received complaints of threats against trans people on campus. His employers have warned that while they support his right to academic freedom and free speech, he could run afoul of Ontario's Human Rights Code and his faculty responsibilities should he refuse to use these pronouns. He told the BBC, "I've studied authoritarianism for a very long time, for 40 years, and they're started by people's attempt to control the ideological and linguistic territory. There's no way I'm going to use words made up by people who are doing that. Not a chance." So this, of course, was all in regard to Canadian Bill C-16, which was, at the time, going before the Canadian Parliament, which prohibited discrimination under the Canadian Human Rights Act on the basis of gender identity and expression. The bill covers the federal government and federally regulated industries like banks or airlines, and it also extends hate speech provisions under Canada's criminal code to transgendered people. So Kyle Kirkup, a law professor with the University of Ottawa, who specialises in gender identity and sexuality law, said, "I don't think any legal expert would say using an inappropriate pronoun, while not something that respects the human rights of trans people, would ever result in a criminal conviction." So if you are unaware and you were either like too young at the time or didn't pay attention to politics at the time, this is essentially what Jordan Peterson built his career on. Now, like I said, he's a hysterical anti-communist, right? So he saw this rise of left-wing activism on college campuses as like the start of like some sort of cultural revolution that's going to usher in totalitarian Marxism, where yes, people like himself will be sent to gulags because they misgendered someone. He was very serious when he used to say this, and of course, you might know, he's decorated his house with loads of Stalinist like art and propaganda as a reminder, he says, that this can happen anywhere. And obviously, I've said this before, and someone got hung up on it recently. I said nearly all anti-communists are fascists. And that doesn't mean like not communist, right? It doesn't mean you're some sort of like anarchist who doesn't want to be a communist. Most of the time, anti-communism, especially from the right, is wrapped up in anti-Semitism and is generally based on fascist conspiracy theories about leftists and Jewish people, right? Jordan Peterson falls firmly into this camp. When he talks about totalitarianism, he talks about like the Gulag Archipelago, he talks about the Black Book of Communism, and, you know, the Gulag Archipelago has its problems. The Black Book of Communism has huge problems, so much so that a few of the authors who actually wrote it actually disavowed the book because the main author of the book would make up the numbers of the deaths caused by communism, and the numbers he was reaching you could only really get to if you both made it up and you also included all the fascists killed in World War II by the Soviet Union and various other communist groups, right? So all of that is the world that Jordan Peterson had immersed himself into. And also, he was someone who pushed for cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, which is really funny because he's someone who is constantly called the left anti-Semitic, where the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory is fundamentally anti-Semitic. It's basically the belief that because the Marxists lost the Cold War, they've infiltrated things like academia and they're brainwashing students to accept Marxism, and it's another way that the Marxists are going to potentially actually win the Cold War in the end. Now, cultural Marxism centers on the teachings of the Frankfurt School, which was influential Jewish intellectuals who had fled Germany during the rise of Nazism and come to America. A lot of it included like progressivism in terms of like race or sexuality and stuff. But Jordan Peterson saw that as a bad thing, right? And there's a speech I used before where he's railing against like ethnic studies, gender studies, saying universities have to get rid of them because it's the way basically the Marxists are spreading their propaganda to this day.
Universities have figured out how to conspire in some sense to pick the future pockets of the students that they're purporting to educate, and they're not educating them, they're indoctrinating them. They're not teaching them how to speak, they're not teaching them how to debate, they're not teaching them how to write, they're not introducing them to the classical wisdom of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition. And that's absolutely appalling, because that's what the bloody institution was there for to begin with, and that's what it's supposed to be doing. And so what people need to do in order to know that they should stop taking the courses is to know what it is that these courses are aiming at. So that needs to be explained. Then they need to know what language the people who teach these courses are using in order to fulfill those aims. Then they need to know how to identify the courses. Then they need to know that it's in their best interest, both, I would say, spiritually and economically, to avoid those courses and those disciplines like the plague. And then maybe we can get the disciplines that have become entirely corrupt and the ones that started that way to put themselves back together before they run themselves out of existence completely. And I might as well name a few of the disciplines that I think are particularly reprehensible to begin with. Obviously, I'm painting this with a very broad brush, and I'm not making the claim that every single person who engages in activity within all of these disciplines has been corrupted beyond comprehension by the postmodernist neo-Marxists, but it's close enough, first pass approximation. So, as I said already, women's studies and all the ethnic studies and racial studies groups, man, those things have to go, and the faster they go, the better. They should have never been put... It would have been better had they never been part of the university to begin with, as far as I can tell. Sociology, that's corrupt. Anthropology, that's corrupt. English literature, that's corrupt.
Now, the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory shares many similarities with the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory from the early 20th century, which was actually used by the Germans to justify all their crimes, in that it portrays a sinister plot by the left to destroy Western civilization. But in the case of the Judeo-Bolshevik stuff, it's obviously at the behest of this Jewish conspiracy theory, where the cultural Marxism one doesn't necessarily specify the Jews. But when you're going that far already, you don't even need to say it, right? And it is fundamentally anti-Semitic, right? So again, hysterical anti-leftist, and also, not that everyone knew this at the time, but let's go into this now, how he became even more popular. Jordan Peterson then became a favourite by the podcast bro circuit, right? And because he was a university professor, he was like, you know, in many ways a lot smarter than the people who would platform him. And that is how he was able to get his messages across politically. So you might have seen him on Ethan Klein's podcast. You might have seen him on Joe Rogan's podcast, where he became a fan favourite. And while he would talk about his self-help stuff, his books that became very popular with these centre-right, right-wing men, at the same time, he would also talk about politics. And he would often talk about the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And I've made a whole video on this. I think Jordan Peterson actually admires the Nazis in many ways, because he fundamentally hates communism so much, he starts liking fascism and pushing fascist arguments, because he was essentially in many ways rehabilitating them, especially Hitler himself.
And we're going to talk about how much Jordan Peterson lies. Because pretty much all the stories Jordan Peterson tells in this clip about Hitler are fabrication.
Hitler was obsessed with order and cleanliness. He was a very orderly person. And he was very sensitive to disgust, you know, because you think, well, the Nazis were afraid of the Jews, you know, because they were other. And that's not right. What's more accurate is that especially Hitler, he was very sensitive to disgust. That's what it looks like. And if you're disgusted by something, then you want to eradicate it. I read a book called Hitler's Table Talk, which was his spontaneous discussions during dinner time from 1939 to 1942. It's really another amazing book. And we had been doing some work inspired a bit by Jonathan Haidt, who's done a lot of work on disgust and the relationship between trait personality. And I was reading this book at the same time, and it was just unbelievable how often Hitler referred to the people he was eradicating, you know, as parasites and as rats and as insects and all of that. So they were kind of put into that category. So, and here's a horrifying part of that story. Like when Hitler first came to power, he put in a lot of public health initiatives, including mass tuberculosis screening, which actually turned out to be a good thing. And at the same time, he went on a beautify the factories campaign. And so he convinced the German factory owners and so forth to increase the levels of hygiene in the factories, to get rid of the rats and the mice, to plant flowers out front, to make everything look neat and orderly. And the insecticide they used was Zyklon. Well, Zyklon, to eradicate the rats and the insects, Zyklon, a slightly different formulation, was the gas that was used in the concentration camps. And so Hitler went from cleaning up the rats and the mice in the factories and the insects, and then he went into the mental hospitals and started cleaning up in there. And then it just went broader and broader, again, sort of one step at a time.
So I think that little clip there has to have been some of the most disgusting revisionism I've ever heard, in that Hitler probably did the Holocaust because he was like a clean freak, essentially. So he pursued these like public health campaigns in Germany, TB screenings and stuff, although that didn't actually happen, so that's a total lie to start with. And he was so disgusted by the Jews, he kind of viewed them as like rats, basically. Like all people he didn't like in Germany, he viewed them as rats. And because he was like such a disgusted clean freak, he started just killing them all, right? This is why so many red flags go off, and like, why does he not talk about why Hitler actually hated the Jews? Like, why is he saying that Hitler was disgusted by the Jews, like he saw them as vermin, right? And that's why he hated them. Not that he described them as vermin because he hated them for other reasons. It's totally bizarre. Like, I cannot understand how anyone who isn't sympathetic to fascism describes Hitler like this. It is the most insane stuff ever. And he didn't pursue public health campaigns because he was just obsessed with cleanliness. And I just find it bizarre Jordan Peterson would even make this up. He's clearly been reading Fabrications, and that Conversations book he brings up, we're going to talk about that a bit later, that is also made up.
So I say to everyone, go check out my video on it, because it's just insane how he has got away with saying so much shit like this just because he packages it in a certain way. And I guess it's because he uncritically goes on podcasts that don't challenge him and don't have the capacity to even challenge him about any of these crazy far-right beliefs that he's always had. So I'm making all of that clear just to show you that Jordan Peterson always had terrible far-right politics, and him being platformed everywhere was just a lot of these liberal and centrist places either not being able to challenge him or not even researching him enough to even confront him about these controversial beliefs, because he never hid them. He always wrapped up his crazy rants and to the hysteria around the pronoun stuff in this anti-leftism, anti-communism, and this cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, right? So he became popular with all that and the self-help stuff. And when I made my initial videos on him, he was also saying like crazy shit about women as well, and blaming women for their own sexual harassment. And I made a video, I remember in 2018, about that, and also about his fans and who he drew to him. And it was usually just like conservative men who loved being told that like their own conservative views were actually like okay, and their views on equality were actually okay, because Jordan Peterson reassured them that because of things like hierarchies and witches and swamps, I don't even want to get into that, their views were actually okay and shouldn't be challenged.
Jacob Logan, 18, from Allison, Ontario, was first in line for Mr. Peterson's talk on Thursday, May 3rd at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. He had arrived 12 hours early wearing a shirt with lobsters stacked upon each other. He also had 100 name tags to hand out, which he scrawled with the name Bucko. It's a nickname Mr. Peterson sometimes uses for his fans. Jacob Logan says, "Whenever I listen to him, it's like he's telling me something I already knew. Learning is remembering." A retired flight attendant from Halifax. Mrs. Bone loved her flight attendant job until she began to find it dehumanising and corporate. Her friend told her the airlines were now run by angry gay queens, she says. She found Mr. Peterson. She feels that he understands the danger of these strange new social forces. He's waking us up in the West. Andrew McVicker, 45, a waiter, says it was good to hear someone finally talk about how hierarchies were okay. He says current politics are pushing for everyone to be the same, promoting women and minorities into unearned positions. It's forced diversity, it's saying you must have X% of ABC, he says. How about look at yourself? It's the perfect way to make money. You see Dave Rubin, Paul Joseph Watson, all these people are making loads of money because they just tell people what they want to hear. In case of Dave Rubin, he brings on people like Jordan Peterson, Tommy Robinson, people like that who say this shit, and people like, I don't have to change, I can just feel prejudiced, I can feel all these beliefs because people like this tell me it's okay. And he's afraid that the Marxist union of Antifa, transgender rights activists, gay rights activists, feminists, all coming together, infiltrating everywhere, and we're going to make, put you in gulags if you don't obey our gender pronouns. That's his fear. Irrational fear.
And for all Jordan Peterson denying he was like very conservative and very religious, it was always clear to anyone with half a brain that this is who he really was, right? And that's why it was such a failing on the media's part that he just got through so easily and got promoted so easily by all these people. Now, 2020 is where he like fully lost his mind. So 2020 is obviously where the coronavirus pandemic shuts down a lot of Western countries and, we are developing vaccines to try and treat it. I believe 2020 was also the year Jordan Peterson was put into a medically induced coma to try and kick an addiction to like benzos, or maybe it was Xanax or some other drug he'd become addicted to. And he actually had to go to Russia to get this done because it's a dangerous procedure and isn't usually recommended for just kicking an addiction. I said at the time, I remember, that it was really hypocritical that a guy who makes people feel so guilty about their addictions and problems and places the whole emphasis on the individual is then seeking treatment to actually not go through those steps that he actually recommends in his self-help books, which were showing he was a hypocrite. But I don't know if it was partly because he was put into this coma or just because loads of people got radicalized during this period. But I remember his Twitter feed was, in 2020 going forward, was absolutely batshit insane. He was like posting every single anti-vax conspiracy theory. He was posting every single far-right account on Twitter, retweeting it. He was on Twitter like absolutely non-stop, making no sense. But basically completely coming out against the vaccine, talking about how vaccine mandates and lockdowns all played into this broader, like, what we've been talking about, moved by the communists under the leadership of Justin Trudeau at this point to actually take over society and curtail Western freedoms. Like, this is the point he fully lost his mind. But I guess because it was relegated to his social media feed, it didn't really enter, I guess, the mainstream consciousness that this guy had fully gone off the deep end. It's also the time where he became even more crazed about being an anti-trans bigot, kept talking about like people being mutilated by gender affirming care. And yeah, like I remember I was in full-time employment at the time and I'd just be bored and going on Twitter and I'd look at his Twitter feed sometimes. I'd just be like, holy shit, like this guy has fully lost his mind, like fully become radicalized into some sort of fascist. But strangely, that's not what made a lot of his fans turn on him. Like, I guess they were just oblivious. I guess they just ignored him. It was only until the next couple years after this, they started turning on him for a variety of different things. And I got them here. They are joining the Daily Wire in 2022. And when he blamed the invasion of Ukraine on Western culture wars and wokeness, and also finally his support for Israel after October 2023. So let's talk about these three things, which, although most left-wing people firmly hated him at this point, these are the things that alienated a variety of different people. Now, I'm going to show you some clips and reaction from an older video I made, but basically, he'd been collabing with, like, I would call them, like, new atheist adjacent, like the Joe Rogan bros, or people who'd be regulars on Joe Rogan's podcast. Like, Jordan Peterson was one, Ben Shapiro was another. Most of the Daily Wire hosts were on there at some point, and weird other people in the intellectual dark web like Dave Rubin, Brett Weinstein, and there was also this ecosystem where all these people would collab. But then Daily Wire actually paid him probably a load of fucking money to actually make exclusive content for them. And a lot of his fans, bizarrely, weren't very happy about this, because I guess a lot of them were still deluding themselves that he was some sort of free thinker, intellectual, and not just a partisan, and not someone who just promote like American conservatism, even though to most people you could easily tell he was always about that. Him actually joining the Daily Wire has outraged a lot of his fans. So here's a post today. I unsubscribed. Jordan Peterson has become a meme. He joined the Daily Wire. I might listen to his podcast on Spotify,
but his YouTube videos have not been interesting lately. Gravitated towards JP because of his authenticity. We can still appreciate all he has done, but as for his legacy, I see it diminishing as he keeps doubling down on these reckless, ego-driven tirades. I personally do not like the idea of him jumping in the same boat as Shapiro. His mainstream presence is merely political theatre next to the intellect of Peterson. That is not to say he isn't intelligent, but let's be honest here. So another on a Why I Joined the Daily Wire post. Let's see what they come up with. If it's entirely trips through the Bible and rants against the left, then I'm not interested. If they offer a forum for those who may oppose and engage with said opponents in a contentious but civil way, then I'll consider it. I would love to believe that Jordan Peterson will be a positive force in the Daily Wire and it will become a big tent that welcomes diverse range of viewpoints. Unfortunately, I expect the opposite to occur. I fear Jordan will become more and more a right-wing talking head. I hope I'm wrong about any of this, or I hope that Jordan engages in some serious self-reflection and decides to strive to find legitimate criticisms of both the right and the left, rather than supporting one tribe unquestionably over against the other. Lord help him. Why money, I money, joined money, daily money, wire money. What is happening to JP? Yeah, I left the JP train a while ago. Now I'm just here because I find it funny how his fan base is starting to get really concerned.
So yeah, obviously wild, considering everything we've already spoke about. This was something that made them kind of hate him. But obviously this makes even more sense. And you can understand why people, like, hated him for this, and it plays into something Jordan Peterson has always done: speak with authority on things he doesn't know anything about. And that has often been history, which I've covered in my work on him throughout my time on YouTube, and it's often politics. And then we get into a more complex subject, we get into geopolitics. When I did my master's in international relations, someone we obviously, you know, if you do international relations, you'll read John Mersheimer a lot. And he is someone who believes in realism in terms of international relations. And for some reason, the lolicon left watched some clips of him and decided he's the most evil guy ever. The way he analyzes Russia and Ukraine, I don't agree with everything he says. And Jordan Peterson was listening to him a lot. And because Mersheimer's interpretation of the invasion was placing, like, more blame on Ukraine than most people would give in terms of what they've done over the last decade before the invasion, Jordan Peterson picked up on this, but he added his own spin. Because he's not a geopolitical analyst. He basically changed the argument of, okay, Russia invaded Ukraine because Ukraine was getting too in bed with the West and might have potentially joined NATO or whatever like that. He added a new element to it where, no, it was because Ukraine is close to the West is woke, and Russia had to invade to stop wokeness coming to Russia.
Are we degenerate in a profoundly threatening manner? I think the answer to that may well be yes. The idea that we are ensconced in a culture war has become a rhetorical commonplace. How serious is that war? Is it serious enough to increase the probability that Russia, say, will be motivated to invade and potentially incapacitate Ukraine merely to keep the pathological West out of that country, which is a key part of the historically Russian sphere of influence? And are not the Russians and the Hungarians and the Poles and the Indians, to a lesser degree, watching and thinking, those people have gone out of their minds? And we have, to say it again, clearly, the culture war in the West is real, and culture is losing, and Russia is part of the West. And the culture war is now truly part of why we have a war. And it's a real war. And it is certainly the case that we do not, therefore, have all the moral high ground, for some part of the reasons that Mersheimer details, and for these reasons of insanity. In fact, how much of it we have at all is something rightly subject to the most serious debate. And so the Russians believe that they have a moral duty, and that they have the highest moral duty to oppose the degenerate ideas, philosophy, theology of the West. And there's something about that that is not wrong.
Like, absolutely bizarre, and you can see why a lot of people, and a lot of people who even liked him, turned on him, because as you can see throughout the world, support for Ukraine generally is a pretty bipartisan thing, right? So like liberals support Ukraine, conservatives support Ukraine. You do get people on the further fringes of the libertarian right and on the more like socialist left that don't support Ukraine, or there's someone like myself that after a certain point like want negotiations. But most people politically firmly fall into I support Ukraine and it's completely Russia's fault and it's completely Putin's fault. So Jordan Peterson not only saying it's Ukraine's fault, but it's actually wokeness's fault, like just broke a lot of his fans' brains and firmly turned loads of people against him. So the first thing I want to read, what a tool Jordan Peterson has become. As an Eastern European, please think about how this situation affects Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Poles and Ukrainians. If Russia's sphere of influence should be respected, that means you reject the right of those nations' self-determination. No one cares about an American culture war in Eastern Europe. Why is he even talking about black women being considered candidates for some jury and his tweets about it? This debate doesn't exist over here, and trying to connect it to the war with Russia is beyond ridiculous. For God's sake, Poland has a conservative government Jordan would love, but they are extremely hawkish on Russia. The recent ramblings by Jordan is extremely hurtful, and I hope people will not go easy on the criticism just because he wrote a popular self-help book. Peterson is so consumed by the Western culture wars that he can't see the difference between a Russian missile and a college kid with pronouns. Sad. Seriously, this dude's completely lost it. A lot of intellectuals and academic types think that because they're experts in one field, they can suddenly jump into another. Sadly, the culture war has consumed many people's mind and turned them insane to the point where they become counter to what they believe in. I've seen this happen with so many people from various backgrounds. He's out of his element. Why does Jordan Peterson think he's a foreign policy expert? This video was sadly the turning point for me. The man has completely lost it. His takes on this issue are just plain ridiculous and low-key propaganda. Same here, his old stuff is still good, but this is the line. Something very fishy is going on with him. He's just not that brilliant nor insightful. For a little while he managed to rap telling people what they wanted to hear and some fairly generic life advice, but underneath he was always this guy, someone who takes little time to understand nuances but is very sure his initial gut reaction was right. Bro, this man really blamed wokeness for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm just, what a take. Blows my mind that people take this guy's political takes seriously. Stick to the psychology, leave the geopolitical analysis to the people who know a thing or two. So that's another element of his fan base that was totally alienated by his comments on something that he didn't really understand. Now, before we get into the Israel stuff, he actually was still a crazed anti-communist, so much so he actually called me out on Twitter because a guy called Konstantin Kizin made a whole video saying that the USSR was worse than Nazi Germany. I replied saying that the only people who think that are actually fascists. Like, no rational, logical person thinks the USSR was worse than Nazi Germany. This guy replied to me, Jordan Peterson must have seen it. And yeah, he wrote me like a nice haiku. But this was when, with this haiku, he was going like fully crazy on Twitter. I talked about him going crazy already. That was one thing. He wasn't even making sense. He was posting pictures of the Joker like every 2 seconds, and there were points in his Twitter spree where he was tweeting like maybe like 50 times an hour all day. Like, genuinely, this guy might have replaced his addiction to prescription drugs with an addiction to the dopamine he gets from social media, because he seemingly could not stop commenting on every single fucking thing. So that brings us to 2023, and that brings us to October 2023. Now, Jordan Peterson had already met with Netanyahu for some sort of Daily Wire event with Ben Shapiro, right? So that pissed off his Muslim fans. But literally, go on this yourselves. I'm not making this up. I didn't edit this. Every single comment in order is actively turning against him. So here's one. How can you criticize Trudeau so hard, rightfully so, and not put any critique next to this post against Netanyahu? You should have stayed true to what you've said. You should uphold the morals you teach in front of everyone. A handshake that's stained with blood. With all the knowledge and intellect you possess, how do you fail to see the corruption and the evil they hold and gruesome vile acts they vomit against Palestinians? It's so sad to see
see you there. What the F, man? You lost a lot of people's respect. How come you haven't noticed anything wrong during your time there? Jordan Peterson is a good man. He's sitting with a wrong person. It's such a shame. How can a mind so great be so easily deceived? I'm glad these people are waking up. I genuinely believe Peterson is concerned about the flourishing of mankind against the repressive powers of tyranny, yet here he is in bed with a tyrant.
But I didn't know this until I made the videos on it back in the day. Jordan Peterson actually had a sizable following in Muslim countries. There were places in like Lebanon that reported that his books were very, very popular, and these are his self-help books. And to me, it's not surprising that his books would be popular. I found them in like Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam because they present a very patriarchal worldview, and the self-help he writes is very compatible with that worldview. So I'm not surprising in any country that has sizable conservative elements, be it Canada, the UK, Lebanon, Vietnam, or whatever, they would find an audience there. But of course, they hated him after this because he firmly took the side of the Israelis and obviously wrote this infamous tweet and constantly backed Israel in the early stages. Now, he doesn't do this so much anymore, but of course, what Muslim fans he had, seeing him back in the Israeli side carrying out the worst atrocities of this century probably anywhere in the world, if there were Muslim fans that didn't give a shit about him joining the Daily Wire, didn't give a shit about his Ukraine takes, liked him for his anti-communism and his anti-trans views, they're probably not going to accept him being pro-Israeli during this time period. So again, that's another element to old PE's downfall. So we've gone through all of this, right? And it's pretty clear he's alienated so many different people. But now he's doing something else. There is a remaining fan base, obviously, of conservatives. So you will have conservatives who are anti-Ukraine, who are pro-Israel, who are pro-Daily Wire, and they are probably the ones still remaining. But now he's drawing more attention to himself by he's calling out Joe Rogan, and he did this recently. He called out Joe Rogan for platforming Dave Smith, who is an American libertarian Jew who had a debate with Douglas Murray about Israel, and Dave Smith does not support Israel. And what's been happening in the right online is there's been a split, obviously, between those who support Israel and those who don't, and Jordan Peterson was siding with the pro-Israeli side, and he's calling the ones who don't support Israel the woke right. So now libertarians and far-right conservatives who oppose Israel are now called woke by Jordan Peterson, and in response, they started calling him woke because obviously he's supporting Israel, and the way he often justifies it is through identity politics, like liberal identity politics. So you get like actual Nazi anti-Semites like Elijah Schaffer replying saying, Jordan Peterson cannot intellectually combat the rise of anti-Zionism and racial consciousness in young white men. So he's resorted to calling them psychopaths after the term woke right failed to help his side. The kind of arrogant rhetoric is why they've lost young minds. Jack Posobiec, again, an actual open fascist. Is this the same guy who recently said saying Christ is king is something psychopaths do? People replying, he's very cowardly. I remember he was a COVID nut job. I'm pretty sure Jordan Peterson is anti-vax as well, so I don't know what the fuck these people are talking about. Jordan Peterson has gone full woke. Sad to see. The Hodge twins. Let's be real. Peterson has called for policing extreme people that spread conspiracies and criticize Israel. Straight out of the woke playbook of censorship that we've seen the left do for years. Why does he want people censored? Does it have to do with him partnering with the ADL group that pushed for COVID vaccine mandates and called people extremists for saying Christ is king? It ain't extreme to put America first and not want our tax dollars funding corrupt countries in war when Americans are broke and our country is going bankrupt. So these two conservative sides, both far right in most cases apart from the libertarians, are all just fighting amongst themselves, calling each other woke. So that's where Jordan Peterson leaves us in 2025. And then, of course, recently, we have this debate with atheists on Jubilee. And I don't think this is like a further part of his downfall. I think everyone, before they watch that debate, have their minds made up on Jordan Peterson. But I think it just showed, once again, this guy is an idiot. This guy can't even handle debating these young people. Like, he doesn't even understand what his argument is. I've always found him someone who is very poor at articulating himself because he just starts ranting and rambling about stuff that make, like, absolutely no sense. So that was funny. That was satisfying. And it just reminded me, oh yeah, like, remember how everyone used to feel about this guy? Remember when you made videos about him in 2017 and 2018 and everyone would dogpile you, calling you an idiot that you didn't understand him? And I was 22 years old when I made these videos, so about the same age as the atheist debating him on Do Believe, right? But and obviously back then, when you're getting an overwhelming dog pile and the mainstream media are normalizing this person, you're like doubting yourself, like, have I missed something? Have I missed something? But I'm glad I've always hated him. I'm glad I called him out since day one, and I'm glad I always called out his crazy anti-communism and his transphobia, because it has been clear since day one. Even if I did doubt myself because of the dog pile, it has been clear since day one, this guy should not be taken seriously. He is a hysterical anti-communist. He is a Christian conservative Zionist. He's a really bog standard conservative Christian Westerner. And it has taken a long time for people to realize he's a bit of a fraud as well. But at the same time, it's just crazy to me he was ever taken seriously. And I guess it just shows the state of the media and the podcast circuit back in like 2017 to 2019. But it's clear throughout the last few years at least, he has alienated so many different conservative elements or more liberal elements who might have supported him based on something like maybe his self-help book or study of the Bible or some shit like that. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed a look back at the downfall of Jordan Peterson. Let me know what you guys think. And also let me know, because this is a long period of time, 8 years, did you used to like Jordan Peterson? Is there something that made you wake up to him being a fraud or just being, not very bright? Let me know down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.